Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar on accelerating the global economic recovery with energy efficient cooling and district energy. I'd also like to thank the Alliance to Save Energy for hosting us today. I'm Axum Tefera, Associate Director of the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, or KCEP, and I'm happy to be joined today by some excellent panelists, Jean Cornell, Ashok Sarker, and Benjamin Hickman, whom I'll introduce later in more detail. My organization, the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, was created after the 2016 Montreal Protocol meeting in Kigali, Rwanda, when leading climate foundations pledged more than $50 million to create the largest ever fund focused on efficient, climate-friendly cooling. Since its inception, KCEP has helped place cooling on the global agenda and has catalyzed a vast network of organizations, companies, and governments to set us on a global path to net zero cooling by 2050. Our areas of work include policy, finance, access to cooling, and industry engagement. Currently, cooling is responsible for 10% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Cooling appliances, such as air conditioners and electric fans, actually consume 20% of electricity used in buildings around the world. By 2050, global AC demand is expected to triple, which could double greenhouse gas emissions from this sector. Cooling is really everywhere. It's in our buildings, whether for space cooling or refrigeration. It's used in industry, transportation, and is essential for cold chains, which support the movement of climate-sensitive food and medicine. And cooling is both a mitigation and an adaptation issue. As the planet steadily warms, urbanization continues its progression, and incomes around the world grow, demand for cooling will rise rapidly in the coming years. And it is important to note that heat is a health and development challenge. So access to low-cost, efficient, climate-friendly cooling for the poorest and most vulnerable populations is central to meeting equity and sustainable development goals. Because growing demand is inevitable, we need to do all we can to integrate and scale both passive and mechanical cooling solutions around the world. Passive interventions include passive cooling building design and urban planning, green infrastructure, and cool roofs. Mechanical cooling solutions encompass high efficiency equipment, low to no GWP refrigerants, and grid connected appliances to minimize cooling's contribution to peak load. As we all know, COVID-19 has posed many crises, but there are many ways in which the cooling sector can step up to help large scale recovery. For example, we're currently seeing COVID cases continue to surge, so many are awaiting the availability of safe and effective vaccines. Once ready though, large-scale deployment will rely heavily on cold chain systems to keep and transport vaccines at safe temperatures. Additionally, the workforce and economic hit from COVID have created disruptions to global food distribution, so scaled cold chains could help to minimize food spoilage and waste. Lastly, as more people have been at home to slow the spread of COVID, residential space cooling needs have increased in summer months. So access to sustainable cooling that can lower energy costs could improve health outcomes and help households save money. Stimulus plans that include efficient, climate-friendly cooling can help meet near and long-term goals of economic recovery, the Paris Agreement, Kigali Amendment, and Sustainable Development Goals. As said before, investment in cold chains would bolster the infrastructure needed to quickly and widely distribute vaccines and reduce food loss. Additionally, recovery plans ought to prioritize low-income communities with heat vulnerability, helping them access the benefits of sustainable cooling technologies and improve building efficiency. Investing in workforce development for new energy efficiency jobs will also be essential for creating an equitable green economy. Then there is also an opportunity for targeted retrofit programs for hard-hit industries with high cooling loads. Today, our panelists will highlight various efficient climate-friendly cooling solutions that can help us achieve both goals of emissions reductions and economic recovery. And we will engage in a discussion on what strategies rise to the top in different regions of the world. Before I pass things along to our first speaker, I invite you all to submit your questions in the Q&A box throughout the session, and I'll raise them to our panelists during the discussion period. Now I would like to introduce our first panelist, Jean Cornell. Jean is a senior policy analyst at Daikin US Corporation, a subsidiary of Daikin Industries Limited, the global leader in air conditioning. She handles government affairs and regulatory activities in North America. Before Daikin, Jean served as a political and finance director for US House of Representatives members. as well as an energy and environment staffer at a Washington, D.C. lobbying firm. Jean, on to you.
Thanks, Axel, and good morning, everyone, or whatever time of day it is. As Axel explained, my name is Jean Cornell. I work for Daikin US Corporation. We have air conditioning, commercial refrigeration, fluorochemicals, air filtration, and oil hydraulic sectors in our business. And I'm going to be talking mostly about the air conditioning side of things. Here in North America, we do residential, light commercial, and commercial and industrial products. As we're starting to think about looking forward to the post-COVID world, we need to balance both what has been going on already, as well as thinking about what consumers and building owners are thinking about as we return to a new normal. On the aspect of what we've already been working on, the first thing at the HVAC industry, we've really been thinking about the refrigerant transition. Here in the US, we have not ratified the Kigali Amendment at this time, but many states have been moving forward on an HFC phase down of some sort. Many of the OEMs are thinking about which refrigerant they want to use. At Daikin, we've already made our selection for select residential, light commercial, and commercial products. And things we were thinking about were not just GWP, the global warming potential of the next generation refrigerant. We've also been thinking about how much charge size we can use with our selection, and how that translates to the size of the unit, and how much energy and electricity we would be using. And when I talk about the size of the unit, that's not just for a footprint for building owners that they need to think about. That also means that we can be reducing the raw materials needed, which is something that is an energy savings that we want to be thinking about. Another aspect of things that have already been going on is decarbonization, particularly at the local and state level, looking to California, to New York, and to other localities across the US. The industry's been looking at, and Daikin in particular has been looking at a few technical solutions. We've been promoting inverters, which is essentially the cruise control of air conditioning, rather than having a single or two-stage system. We found that the energy savings can be up to 58% equivalent for non-inverter type air conditioners. We've also been looking at heat pumps, which had a sour name in the past, but have really come into their own over time, and found that they're about 300% efficient for non-heat pump systems. Axel, I know you were talking about what incentives can be around, and wanted to highlight Efficiency Main's rebate program. Understanding that this can be a high upfront cost, programs like Efficiency Mains can really get this into the homes and lives of people who need it. And now shifting to the COVID response, we're always thinking about these existing goals of how to reduce emissions, how to be sustainable companies and with sustainable products. But we also want to be thinking about what other industries are doing right now. I'm thinking in particular of the transportation sector. I know that California has moved towards their new goal in the 2030s for the electric vehicle base. And that's going to be drawing a lot of energy that from the grid. And so we want to be reducing our energy use as much as possible. So homeowners and people and the residential sector can plug their car in and also have their homes cooled at the same time and not have to worry about how much energy is being used and placing too much burden on the grid. We're also thinking about the new normal, and particularly the return to work. One aspect is ventilation. That's obviously such a high energy use process. And so we want to make sure that going through the filters, that we're not going through a high pressure job and wasting a lot of energy. We're also thinking about in the workplace, creating zoning and creating microclimates so people can feel safe in their offices or in wherever they are in the building. But a lot of this can be enabled through controls, through apps, and we're really looking towards the Internet of Things as a way to enable solutions in the future. So it's an exciting time to be indoors. Back to you, Axel.
Thanks so much, Jean. We appreciate that private sector perspective in this discussion. So now I'd like to introduce Ashok Sarker. Ashok is a senior energy specialist team leader working on clean energy operations at the World Bank's Energy and Extractives Global Practice in Washington, D.C. for the past 15 years. Ashok's career includes more than 25 years across organizations like the Asian Development Bank, USAID, and RMA USA. He has also led and participated in energy efficiency and clean energy operations in over 40 countries. At present, he is focused on demand-side energy efficiency, super ESCOs, solar PV, electric mobility, and sustainable cooling projects. Ashok, on to you.
Thank you very much, Axum. Can you hear me, first of all?
Yes.
Excellent. And thank you for a very generous introduction. Yeah, I do end up wearing multiple hats, and definitely cooling is one of those areas where in the World Bank, we have found that cooling is a challenge which is actually growing at a rate that it's going to heat up our planet. And so we are really trying to find out solutions here in this group as well to see how sustainable cooling can slow down the heating up of our planet. I mean, that is the fundamental challenge. I work for the World Bank's energy practice. Our global energy practice gives a lot of importance to climate change as well as energy efficiency and renewable energy. And quite obviously, cooling is the interface of all those development paradigms. And it's important because cooling is not just for the sake of putting on ACs, but it's thermal comfort, which is linked to other sustainable development goals, your health of people, well-being, productivity. All those are very, very important goals which the developing world in particular are trying to achieve. And without cooling, it cannot happen. But without sustainable cooling, we get caught up in a vicious cycle of producing more and more greenhouse gases. And as statistics, for example, I saw an IPCC report, which I think, Axum, you must have also mentioned, that even with 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in the global temperature, the number of people who will be vulnerable to heat would double from the current 1 billion to 2.5 billion people. And 40% of the people in the world live in tropics. And can you imagine, I mean, what devastation it will bring if we don't fix this vicious cycle by plugging in the right interventions at the right phase of this cycle. And the World Bank is really involved in that. We have multiple projects, multiple interventions in over 100 countries, and they're geared towards policy interventions, towards financing interventions, towards new business models, and to see how the existing technologies per se can be implemented at scale. Interestingly, you must have heard that the Singapore's founder, when he was alive, Lee Kuan Yew actually had said that the growth of Singapore by almost 100-fold between 1960s when Singapore came into existence and 2010, in 50 years, 100-fold GDP increase. He gave the entire credit to air conditioning. He said that without the comfort in homes, in offices, in factories, Singapore would not be at the stage where it is today. So you can imagine that it is a development challenge which permeates through energy sector development, to health issues, to general well-being of the people. World Bank has two primary objectives when we operate. Our topmost high-level, if you say helicopter view, is that we want shared prosperity and we want reduced poverty. And both those goals are, again, through the Sustainable Development Goals, linked to providing adequate thermal comfort and cooling to people around the world. And of course, we talk about 1 billion people not having electricity today. That has been known for a while. It's one of the goals which all of us are trying to help achieve. But a same number of people don't even have cooling. So you are really talking about a challenge which is multifaceted, because unfortunately, cooling is driven by energy. And when you have energy shortage, you have cooling shortage. And therefore, they're integrally linked to each other. And while we look at these, we really need to come up with smarter solutions because technology is not the barrier, as I said. Today, if all the air conditioners in the world were to use the best of class available technology in developing country markets, we would be using 50% less energy to meet the same amount of thermal comfort. But yet, even the developed countries don't have high penetration of efficient appliances and air conditioners. So I think it's the same kind of fundamental challenges which we are facing in the energy efficiency sector actually gets translated much more in a complex manner in the cooling sector, because cooling is, again, not a single appliance. Cooling means energy efficient fans for some people. It could mean cool roofs for others. It could mean refrigeration for cold chain, for food and vaccines. It could really have so many multiple uses and multiple interventions that there is no one size fits all. So what we need to do through these kind of interactions, which the Alliance very nicely have put together along with our colleagues from the private sector, Kigali Cooling Efficiency Fund, and the UNEP others, is to come up with these ideas and exchange solutions and not try to reinvent something new, because existing solutions are there, they are working. All we need to do is scale it up. And the post-COVID context has become even more important because COVID is a game changer. It has brought forward the importance of us doing much more on climate change. And we're going to talk about it a little later, but it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. It's a blessing in disguise in a way for all of us to think much more proactively to find solutions where governments and private sector can work together either through stimulus packages or outside of them and come up with solutions which hits both economic growth agenda, of which cooling is an important part, but also the climate change agenda. And again, we can go into the details, but in the interest of time, I guess I'll stop here. And again, thanks a lot to the Alliance for inviting me, and of course to Axum and other colleagues to providing this opportunity to be a part of this panel. Over to you, Axum.
Thank you for those remarks, Ashok. And I think it's a really good point you raised about the best available technologies really being there and being effective now. And it's about how do we scale those more widely. So now I'd like to welcome Benjamin Hickman. Benjamin is Regional Advisor for Asia and Europe at the UNEP-led District Energy and Cities Initiative, and also supports the work of UNEP on cold chain and urban cooling in Asia, in addition to the new UNEP-led Integrated Urban Systems Partnership. Benjamin joined UNEP's Paris office in 2014 and has spent the last 2 years in the Delhi office before moving back to Paris mid-pandemic. Before UNEP, Benjamin worked for an energy consulting firm focused on renewable energy policy, financing, and market modeling. Benjamin?
Thanks, Axum, and thanks as well to the Alliance for inviting me here today. I think Ashok actually summed up so well, I think, a lot of the overlapping context of cooling being for development, for helping us meet Kigali, the SDGs, Paris Agreement. So I'm not going to go into that same argument because I think you've characterized it so well. I'm going to put my hat on. I was presenting here a partnership that UNEP's been leading since 2014, the District Energy and Cities Initiative, which was a sustainable energy for all accelerator under energy efficiency. And what we've been trying to do is raise the voice of one of the specific technologies that are part of that palette that a city or a consumer can pick up. And on the cooling side, that's district cooling. I think it's a technology that was overlooked for quite a few years, and it's definitely not the natural choice. We wouldn't say it's never the lowest hanging fruit. I'd say it's a sort of middle hanging fruit in terms of it's difficult. It's not something which cities have found easy to pick up without support. And it's broadly remained in specific regions. So Japan, Korea, Europe, the Middle East, North America. And we really have seen that its transition into, and China, and its transition into kind of the global south has been quite difficult. And there's multiple barriers for why that has happened. It's, you know, not something that you can pick up and run with immediately. It requires capacity in local governments. It's got a lot of myths around cost, etc. But when we look at the energy efficiency it can achieve, and in dense urban areas, it really is the most efficient way of providing mechanical cooling to a building. There's a real onus on us to sort of shift this technology from just being a sort of Western technology into these different markets. And that's been the role of the District Energy in Cities initiative. We're working across 14 countries. We have a pipeline of almost $900 million of district cooling projects. And some of these projects will be the first in their countries, or the first that a city's putting forward. So we're working on a district cooling project in India. We're supporting ones in Malaysia, in North Africa, Colombia. And the model isn't that UNEP is supposed to have this role of in each city supporting a district cooling project. It's that there's a real momentum that can be built when that first or second project in a country comes about. And that momentum, you know, can be taken up by other actors and by the national government to actually expand that to all cities. And why is district cooling important now when we're looking at, you know, sort of post-COVID recovery? And I think there's multiple reasons. One is, and we wrote about this back in 2015, district heating or district cooling, the systems, they normally come about from a real catalyst. There's some catalyst that makes them happen. And if you look in the Nordic countries, the district heating systems, they came about from the oil crisis. These countries didn't want to use higher priced oil anymore, so they really catalyzed district heating. And I think COVID can be a catalyst for district cooling if we do it properly. And I think the role of COVID in, you know, we want to protect and retain wealth in our cities, and district cooling, you know, like all energy efficiency, helps us to retain wealth and stop sending millions every day out in paying for electricity or fossil fuels. The resilience that it brings, obviously thermal storage is a way that a city can reduce the amount of power infrastructure it needs, but there's other resilience benefits, and colleagues have talked about, you know, the importance of just having thermal comfort, and Singapore has district cooling in some areas. It's a huge economic driver to have a thermal comfort in your offices and workspaces. And secondly, district cooling, we do see it as a way that it's, for a city to have a wide district cooling network, it's not going to happen without the municipal government support. So one model we're promoting is that cities help put in upfront the network, or help catalyze a network, and they can use that actually as a way to get long, stable returns. And then in the long term, if they want to refinance it, they can get that funding back. And I'll give you one example of how that was done in North America. So in Toronto, I don't know if you know, but there's a 75,000 ton district cooling project, which, you know, the city helped bring about. The city played a huge leadership role, and then was able to sell it for $430 million, netting, I think, $90 million profit, which they can then reinvest. And so that model, where we can use stimulus funding perhaps, or low interest rate loans for a city to start a district cooling project, take on the risk there is, you know, cities are able to manage that risk in terms of the real estate development, and then refinance it, so in the long run they can reinvest that money. And we're doing that in Rajkot now. The city's already building, Rajkot's in India, the city's already building its district cooling pipeline. And then once it's built and the project's de-risked, it wants to, you know, hopefully it can in the long run sell that portion and have that available for other city priorities. So district cooling is really, the time is right now, especially as we look at stimulus packages and, you know, making our cities much more comfortable, and this thermal comfort need that when I lived in Delhi, it was just obvious I couldn't go to work without having air conditioning. I just wouldn't have been able to work for about 3 months of the year at least. And, you know, there's other benefits. for example, the maintenance, I've seen a question come up. Maintaining individual split ACs in an office environment, there's a huge amount of refrigerant loss, there's a huge amount of inefficiency. Bringing in a district cooling operator really lets us outsource that maintenance to a professional that is there all the time to do it. So huge benefits on that side as well. But yeah, I'm happy to take that more up in the questions, but that's my opening. Thanks, Axel.
Thank you, Benjamin. And really important to make that connection between these international and national goals we set with more local government priorities and where there's overlap there. So appreciate that. I do want to pose a few questions to the panel, and then we'll get into the Q&A box. And so again, I encourage all attendees to submit your questions or comments there, and we'll work through those in a moment. But first, I do want to go to Jean. As we all know, the US election is still fresh on everyone's minds. And so could you share your thoughts on what impacts an incoming Biden administration might have on energy efficiency activities in the US?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, from a refrigerant transition standpoint, the Trump administration and Congress right now has been not as active on Kigali. There is federal legislation in Congress that would essentially implement the goals of Kigali, but that's not been passed at this point. So there's been a real state effort that's creating sort of a patchwork. Anticipating looking ahead, there'll be much more of a central federal role for the government starting in 2021. So I think that's the biggest thing to be looking for to the next year.
That's great. That's great. And then as a company focused on technology, what indoor environment considerations should building owners, and policymakers have in mind when planning for a return to work once we do get back to some level of normalcy?
Yeah, Ashok and Benjamin both made really good points about thermal comfort indoors and how that's linked to productivity and the health of people. I think specifically on the policymaker side of things is thinking about ventilation requirements and building owners as well. That is a huge energy zap, and bringing in the outdoor air is now a need that people are seeking indoors. But thinking ahead towards urban communities, which often are low-income and communities of color, or think about the West Coast with the wildfires, there's going to be need for even additional air filtration. So trying to balance that, satisfying customer needs, providing healthy indoor air, but also trying to reduce as much energy use as possible. I think that's something that people are going to need to be thinking about.
Thanks for that perspective. Ashok, if I could turn to you, what are key challenges faced by emerging economies for implementing sustainable cooling measures at scale?
Thanks, Axel. I really feel that cooling faces the same challenges, even more, which energy efficiency in general faces in most of the developing countries. Number one challenge is the pricing and the subsidies of energy. Now, as long as there will be high subsidies in energy pricing, the cooling or any other sustainable cooling, efficient cooling, cooling with low GWP refrigerants, or with efficient lighting and electric vehicles, et cetera, will never be attractive enough to reach the financial bar which many consumers look at while making decisions to adopt cooling technologies and any other technology. Number two, there is lack of awareness. If you go around the world, it's not that everybody knows that these technologies exist today, like Benjamin was talking about in district cooling. And I'll give an example. Not many people who live in Singapore know that the Singapore's Marina district is actually fed by district cooling. And it is consuming 50% less energy than what individual air conditioners would have cost in those high-rise buildings. It's funny because they're paying for this, but they're not realizing that this technology is already being used. So I'm just giving an extreme example like that, but that's the fact. Many countries have standards and labeling programs, but are they being implemented? Let me turn off this Are they being implemented well? Enforcement of standards is a whole different challenge compared to just putting in the right standards and specifications. I know Daikin, for example, has one of the best air conditioners in the world, but are you able to push that in countries where, even though the air conditioner standards would allow you to do that, but the enforcement is so weak? So these are the kind of challenges, fundamental challenges which we need to address first. And final challenge in cooling is it's not, as I said, a single type of equipment. You have air conditioners, vapor absorption cycle based, vapor compression cycle based, you have chillers, you have district cooling, you have refrigeration, you have cold chain equipment, you have cool roofs, you have mobile cooling, and each one of them requires a different kind of intervention sometimes, because the barriers for each one of them are different, because they are a different set of stakeholders and users. So I think overall, final challenge is the financing challenge. Even though these will all pay off, the incremental cost, the first cost, continues to be a big challenge in countries, particularly in space cooling area, where the issue of split incentives come in. Now, if you are a renter and staying in an apartment, the apartment owner has the least motivation to buy the most efficient appliance, unless the renter somehow pays for it and is ready to pay for it. But the renter comes much later. So the whole split incentives problem linked to financial barriers is again an issue which we need to come up with, finding business solutions and smart solutions which can solve it. Over to you.
Thank you for that. And you've highlighted the essence of many of the challenges we face, but in the developing countries where you've been working, clean and energy efficient space cooling stands out as a critical opportunity for both enhancing thermal comfort and mitigating climate change. So what do you see as some implementation approaches and financing solutions that can address both the development agenda and the climate goals and access issues?
And a good question. In fact, there was a chat question about space cooling and HVAC and the importance we give to, so much importance to HVAC. It's true. Statistically, out of the 20 or 19 or 20 pieces of cooling equipment sold every second now until 2030, 2050, as per estimates, almost half of them are air conditioners, space cooling. Now, the challenge which comes to the space cooling can be overcome because you are not, of course, there is always a need to improve the technologies and help countries move to low GWP refrigerants. But today's technologies are able to reduce 50% of energy consumption in space cooling if the right interventions are done. So what are the ways of doing it? So the solutions have to be there in terms of policies and financing, but also, as I said, supported by awareness building, supported by looking at off-grid solutions, for instance, because half of the world, half of Africa, for instance, is still relying on off-grid technologies from solar power. They're not going to be able to run in a home a regular traditional air conditioners, which you and I have in the United States. There you have to think about DC-based solutions, much more efficient solutions, much more smaller air conditioners, perhaps even renewable energy-driven absorption chilling systems. So I think the idea is that when you are talking about a whole lot of technologies, you have to think about policies. Of course, standards and building codes, of course, is very important, because again, if you don't reduce the need for cooling by the right building envelope, you're going to keep increasing. There's no end to it. So I use the principle of reduce, and actually service more efficiently, and then optimize. Because a lot of digitalization is going on now. Now, I'm sure Daikin would be very much aware, and many of these companies are actually bringing in these new digital technologies to make cooling much more optimized and much more efficient. So the point is a combination of policies, financing, and business models, which is either through, ESCOs or super ESCOs or, utility pay-as-you-save programs, and all kinds of business models are already there. A combination of policies and business model which addresses these barriers and the financing barrier, to be precise, really can help in scaling up this impact. And also don't forget the impact of all this on jobs. COVID, as you said, Axum, that jobs has become a very important issue. I was just in a seminar a little while ago where we heard about, even in the Middle East region, which is one of the regions where I work, between now and 2050, there'll be 300 million people looking for jobs. Okay, here we know in the United States, 2.5 million people are employed in the energy efficiency sector, half of which are in the HVAC sector. So we know that when you shift from high fossil intensive sector to more cleaner, efficient, renewable, sustainable cooling sectors, there's this co-benefit of jobs. How do you bring that into the business model and the policy makers' decision-making process is again a challenge which we need to think through. But so the point is, the world is going through huge disruption, decentralization, decarbonization, these are all important. We need to think about integrated solutions to cooling. And finally, behavioral changes. You cannot keep your AC in a hotel room at 20 degrees Celsius just because it's free, because you're paying for the hotel room. Most people do that. It's unfortunate. Those ACs should have a thermostat which does not let you go below, let's say, 24 degrees Celsius, in my opinion. And many countries like India, like Korea, like Japan, have policies which say in the office, your temperature setting cannot go below a certain level. So I think those, like in Japan when Fukushima happened, they said, you don't need to wear suits because this makes you feel that you need to turn on your AC down. Take off your suit, turn on your AC up. So I think we have to think about behavioral solutions as well. So it's a combination of different solutions really, which will solve the vicious cycle of the challenge, I would put it that way. Thank you, over to you.
That's great and comprehensive. And I do want us later to return to the behavioral change issues and the necessity of more renewable energy on the grid or with distributed energy resources to really help us with this green transition. Before we get into that, I'd like to go to Benjamin and ask, so you're working on several public-private partnerships based at UNEP. How do such platforms translate into on-the-ground results and how do you measure their success?
Yeah, thanks, Axum. So there's two specific initiatives I think I'll talk about. The first is, as I introduced at the start, the District Energy and Cities Initiative. Here we have just over 65 public-private partners globally and 45 champion cities. And that can be quite a lot to manage. There's a lot of different opinions that within the district energy industry, but everybody in that industry has one single objective, which is to expand it. And, you know, there are commercial reasons why to expand it for some partners, but overall it's the environmental benefits that it will bring as well. And I think it wasn't before that initiative, there wasn't perhaps the right voice in the right places plugging district energy and, you know, the collaborative effort of private sector, the UN, different countries doing that, plugging it into different places has a huge impact. And now I think we are seeing 5 years later, you know, more people talking about district energy. And I think that's, you know, a sign of the times. And it's not just because of this initiative, but I think that long effort of plugging it has made a difference. And I think we've seen that on cooling as well. Like I think 5 years ago, people weren't talking about cooling in the same way as they were today. And there's multiple reasons for that. But even heating, I remember back in 2015, we were trying to make the point, you know, you need to think about heat. This isn't an electricity problem. This is a heat problem in the EU. And the same thing is happening with cooling now. Stop thinking about cooling as a power sector problem. It's not, it's its own problem. And I think, you know, that coordinated effort of people talking about cooling is really important. And it's part of the reason we've helped bring together the Cool Coalition, which has over 100 partners and the secretariat is in UNEP, but really it's run by its members with just big level ambition. You know, we need to raise the profile of cooling. We need to reduce and shift the amount of cooling demand. Raise awareness, as Ashok mentioned, is super important. But you know, that's a lot of talk. And how do both of those lead to action on the ground? Well, in district energy, we early on decided it would be an implementation-focused initiative. We raised funds with partner support and country support to showcase district energy projects on the ground. And we're tracked on our investment on how many projects come about, and we're starting to see huge impacts. Chile's incorporated district heating into its presidential plan. India's got an India Cooling Action Plan, which includes district cooling. There's different ways we track it. Finance coming into the sector. The Cool Coalition, it's a much younger, but much more ambitious, I'd say. And I saw a question about cold chain. It's a super important sector that hasn't had the attention it's needed, and as part of economic recovery, it's one of the really obvious sectors post-COVID to invest into, especially the link up between agriculture and vaccine cold chain. So under the Cool Coalition, we're setting up a working group on cold chain, and there's more activities that will come on this, because it's not just about reducing food loss and waste, it's about increasing the value that a farmer can get for its crops. It's about how are we going to transport up to 10 billion doses of COVID vaccine around the world in 2 years, which might need to be chilled at -80 degrees. Like, these are huge questions, and it's a huge amount of focus that needs to go onto that now. And the Cool Coalition, I think, has a lot of different partners that will help us bring that focus, but it's obviously not the only solution, but that collaboration is super important.
Fantastic. And because a lot of your work also focuses in on district cooling, we know that district cooling is just one part of the solution, but it's not appropriate for everywhere. How do we foster a more integrated approach in cities on cooling, and what are the benefits to a city for doing that?
Yeah, so I think this actually, it links to the last point, in that a single district heating utility or district cooling utility coming to a city and saying, we have your solution for the whole city, it's just district cooling, just doesn't work. And actually, we need to have a much more nuanced and integrated way of looking at cooling. And the Cool Coalition, has a series of, at first we're trying to reduce the amount of demand, shift the demand, and then improve it. And really, as we go into a city, we shouldn't just be talking about, let's get a district cooling project. It should be, well, here's a district cooling area, but first of all, let's work on building efficiency so we can reduce the size of the district cooling system. And that's social housing that, it might not be possible to connect. Let's implement some super efficient ACs for them in one of their rooms. So at least each social housing block can have one room that has air conditioning. Doesn't need to be the whole flat. We can have super efficient buildings. We can have cool roofs, green roofs. And it's about saying to the city, hey, you've got extreme heat, you've got extreme heat deaths, your extreme heat planning, let's upgrade that to look at what are the actual measures you can take around urban greening, supporting district cooling, using your building stock to help cool down the city. So that more integrated approach, where it's new, and I think people at ESMAP have done work on that. There are a lot of cities that have showcased how to do it, but now taking that to different countries is part of our emphasis, and we're launching work on that in Vietnam and India, and it should grow. Like, we shouldn't just be so technology focused when we support cities, and the other part of that is building up the case that cities take action on cooling. Like, that's a huge piece of work. It's not just standards and labels and national building codes. It's the city has got a role as well, and so a big part of that work is building that role. Thanks.
Thank you, Benjamin. I do want to now bring in more of the audience questions, and I'd love to first start with Jean, but Ashok and Benjamin, feel free to chime in if appropriate. One attendee noted a very important point of the widespread lack of preventative maintenance for refrigeration and ACs, causing energy hogs to consume 25% more electricity than it should. What are your thoughts or perspectives on what maintenance programs are being pushed that seem to be a good model for other places?
And I actually just replied to this in the chat, but I'm happy to verbalize it again. It's a twofold effort. I think first, it's the human side of things. I can only speak for Daikin, but we do have a broad technician training program in addition to distributor trainings. So that really ensures that the know-how is passed on to the people who are in the field doing the work. But I think the other aspect is looking to how we can work smarter, not harder. This involves monitoring and controls. On our commercial side of things, we use a system called Intelligent Solutions, which works with building owners so they can see how their systems are functioning. And by having that eye, you don't have to send a tech out into the field if there's no issue at all, just to see how it's going. You can really see in real time how a system is performing, and then move forward through maintenance efforts.
Ashok or Benjamin, would you like to add any examples here?
No, just a quick point is that, for example, in the India Cooling Action Plan, for those of you who are aware of, this issue of, it emerged very, very prominently. So unless you can do these downstream operation and maintenance issues well, much of the gains will be lost. And so the India Cooling Action Plan, for instance, actually puts a lot of emphasis on two things: training. So you have to have a trained workforce which can actually go and fix these appliances. So many of the countries which we work in, particularly in Africa, they're still importing some of these appliances. That sometimes stymies the downstream maintenance and operation chain of workers, because they're in the business of importing and putting it. Whereas in the United States, you see that whenever there is an HVAC system being put, the company keeps calling you again and again, saying that, would you like to be a part of our maintenance plans? See, I think it's that fundamental problem which exists in many of these countries. And the India Cooling Action Plan is a good example. And the other point is that when it comes to this maintenance, the impact of digitalization is something which we need to explore more. Because having worked in the MENA region, where in the Middle East, where you know that space cooling in commercial buildings, malls, offices, hotels is almost like 70 to 80% of the electricity demand. There, each of these hotels and big buildings and universities and schools and hospitals have a dedicated energy management systems and teams which take care of those. It's not just like plug and coming out, but really keep pushing the envelope in maintaining those systems. So many of the countries which we are working on, the energy service company contracts, the ESCO contracts, are being combined as a capital investment plus maintenance contracts, rather than just doing investments and getting out of the system. So I think we have to, again, think through these business models and solutions which are working in different parts of the world. It's a matter of putting together and stitching them together and adapting them to different situations. But again, a lot of training would be required. A lot of workforce planning, green workforce planning is required. It's not going to happen overnight. And it's not just the energy sector which will be doing this. We need to bring in the universities, the technical vocational training schools, and other communities into this discussion to be able to really develop a downstream operation and maintenance value chain as well.
Can I quickly add? I mean,
Yeah.
I think one additional thing is that the refrigerant loss and refrigerant handling, that is also a huge, it's not just the energy efficiency, it's the refrigerant loss that happens at these, especially split ACs. That really, we need to have a much better maintenance program. And I know in India, like Ashok said, formalizing what is often an informal sector as well. There's a lot of informal maintenance of these devices, which leads to huge refrigerant losses. On district cooling and actually I would also say cooling as a service, one thing that gets written in is this maintenance, and you're basically giving maintenance of the cooling to a company that either has expertise or even owns the cooling equipment itself. And in district cooling, we go from having thousands of different cooling appliances to maybe 3 or 4 different district cooling stations operated by an expert team 24/7 with proper tracking. And in places where we can do that, we should, because there's huge demonstrated benefits of reduced refrigerant emissions from these. Even if you are using HFCs, the amount of HFC used per year by district cooling is much less. And we can start to use HFCs, which we can't, we can start to use refrigerants we can't use at an individual building level. Like ammonia, for example. There's no way we could use that at an individual building level. Well, it can be, but it's very dangerous and difficult. Once you have a district cooling plant, we can start to put in the safety protocols around some of these refrigerants. So yeah, just those.
That's
two
great.
points.
Yeah, can I just comment too quickly on both what Ashok and Benjamin said? First, for the Benjamin's point on split systems, I think it really comes down to technician training and technician installation. OEMs are really working hard to make sure that the systems reduce the leaks as much as possible, but it comes down to in the field, in an individual person's domicile. That's where it comes down to. And then for Ashok's point about building up the workforce, something that we see here in the US is workforce development. And I think that's something that just as people are looking ahead, especially on the policymaker side, incentivizing young people getting out of school, out of high school, out of college to look towards this industry, the cooling industry, is a profitable place to stake their claim.
Thank you for that. That's great. If Benjamin, you could quickly respond to this one question on district cooling, and we see it being effective for commercial and industrial needs. How can this be translated for residential use in the global south, where there may not be access to electricity?
Yeah, so I think first up, district cooling is always going to serve better for commercial and industrial needs. That is definitely, just the evidence we see globally. But we do see a lot of residential applications, and where it works well is where you have mixed use development, and that's why it kind of triggers back into urban planning. Like, let's make our developments mixed use, huge benefits on energy, but it also helps here. People are using a commercial building during the day, and then they're going home and cooling their residence at night. You can actually get a huge diversity benefit by having residential customers on the district cooling network. So we always look for 10, 15, 20% of residential if possible. I think there's a huge amount of residential district cooling in the UAE. There's examples in Barcelona, North America, but it's difficult. And you're going from a normal district cooling system, which maybe is serving 20, 30 clients, to suddenly serving 5,000 clients. And that's just a completely different model, and it can work. One other area that I'm really interested in is how can district cooling help lower income group housing? There are ways of doing district cooling where we don't have to have a ventilation ducting work. We can do it with a very cheap fan coil in one room in a social housing, and use the return temperature from the district cooling network. So actually you could possibly even provide free cooling into social housing or very low cost, as part of a extreme heat prevention. That's a new area of work, but it's definitely possible. And there's already a residential district cooling application in India, so it's definitely possible in these kind of developing countries.
Thank you for that. And there are two questions that I'm going to try to weave in together. One is, what's the effect of urban heat island, right, on the demand for these mechanical cooling systems, and how can we kind of rely more on passive cooling solutions? And I'd love your perspectives there. And similarly, for cases where there are mechanical cooling needs, how do we make sure there aren't adverse effects for low-income people? How do we make sure that they're reaping the financial benefits instead of just the costs, right? And so I'd like to start with Ashok here.
Yeah, I didn't quite get the second question, but maybe I'll read it again. But on the first one, very interesting question that in general, when we look at the numbers across the world, around the world, when you go from a city to a rural area, you feel that the temperature has gone down nowadays. It happens in the developed world, it happens even in the developing world. So I think it's quite obvious that all this, densification of increase of urban population, rising middle incomes does cause this negative effect of urban heat island. And we have done experiments using cool roofs, for example, in various cities in India, but also we have seen them happening in Los Angeles and many parts of the US and Canada and Europe, where just by bringing a few temperatures down, by putting cool roof material, you have brought down the energy consumption. And then they would do the temperature scanning in general, will find that the ambient temperature in that locality would have gone down by a few degrees. So I think there is a perfect correlation between energy use in air conditioning and this vicious cycle of causing urban heat island effect. And there are benefits to then having interventions in reducing the energy consumption for cooling, either through efficient mechanical cooling or cool roofs, or I would say again, passive cooling, building envelopes. I think we are missing out the big elephant in the room, that we often jump into conclusions that, oh, let's buy the most efficient air conditioner. But let's fix the house first. Let's have better insulation, triple glazed windows, and do passive measures first. So what you said, Benjamin, is that reduce it first, reduce the cooling load, then serve the cooling load most efficiently, rather than serving the very bad cooling load with a bad set of solutions. This is not going to lead to optimized solutions. So I think we really need to think again holistically, and the urban heat island effect, absolutely, I can, if required, we can share a bunch of papers which we had published on this topic. We are continuing to do this work in Bangladesh, for instance, where we are looking at the city of Dhaka, where very dense number of buildings, and we are trying to see if putting cool roofs there and efficient air conditioners would reduce in the city context, not in every part of the city, but we are picking up certain zones of the city to see what would be the impact on urban heat island there. So, and there are many other groups which are working on this as well around the world, as we understand. And we have a report on cool roofs and urban heat island effect, which we published just last month on this particular topic.
Thank you, Ashok. Jean, any comments there?
Yeah, I really like Ashok's comments looking at the whole building. I think that's something that we need to do more of. And I talked about it earlier in my opening comments about efficiency main in particular. There is a divide. It's high upfront cost, but the more efficient solutions will save money in the long run. But because the technology is so high upfront cost, it's really cost prohibitive to some people, particularly low-income communities. And so this is a place that the government has a really good opportunity to incentivize the purchase of these technologies. And I think looking ahead for COVID response, this is a wonderful opportunity to bring that in and to say, hey, this is a new time to be indoors. Here's a way for you to improve your indoor environment.
Thank you. And Benjamin, quickly, if you could, thank you.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think it's a scourge of like cities worldwide. What Ashok and Jean have both said, I completely agree with. I think another area we need to look at is urban planning and how we're designing neighborhoods. The shift from super dense areas, like there's a huge benefit from shading, but then you've got limited looking at the sky is unable to cool the area at night. There's urban greening. We need to raise the capacity of urban planners to deal with this problem. And then secondly, just from the district cooling angle, centralizing those heat exchangers and centralizing those cooling towers, you can put them in an area of city where there's maybe a little less impact on heat island, and with thermal storage we can also produce the cooling at night rather than during the day when it's hot. So there's some benefits around urban heat island with district cooling, but it's not a panacea. You need to look at everything really altogether.
Thank you. And that kind of covers a big question I wish we had time to delve more deeply into, of what are transformative actions that we can take. But I think the crux of it is that cooling is challenging and complex, and so it will require many different strategies together. Foundational approaches include adoption of the Kigali Amendment and high efficiency standards. Hopefully all of this in a recovery context. But again, passive cooling, very important and underutilized right now. So I'm hoping in a follow-up email to you all, we can share some of these publications and resources that we've mentioned. And I'm sure all panelists are happy to engage in further discussions. But I want to thank the panelists. This was an excellent discussion. Appreciate it, Jean, Ashok, and Benjamin, and your expertise here today, really excellent. And thank you all for joining us in this conversation, and we hope it'll continue, especially with these collaboratives that exist and continue to grow on the topic. So thank you all, and have a great rest of the day.